Nobody walks in like that. Part 1. The room reads her wrong. There is a moment, and if you have lived long enough, you have felt it, when you walk into a room and the room makes a decision about you before you open your mouth, before you take your second step, sometimes before the door even finishes closing behind you. The room looks at your shoes. The room looks at your jacket. The room looks at the way you carry yourself, the lines on your face, the brand on your watch, or the absence of one, and in the time it takes to draw a single breath, the room has already written your story, filed you away, decided what you are worth and what you are not. Most people feel that judgment and adjust. They stand up straighter. They smile wider. They perform some version of themselves that the room might find acceptable. She didn't, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened inside Ironside Arms on that Friday afternoon in November, you have to understand what Ironside Arms was. Not just as a business, but as a place, as a kind of world unto itself, the type of world that exists in certain corners of Texas and nowhere quite like it anywhere else. Ironside Arms sat on the eastern edge of San Antonio, just past the point where the city stops pretending to be something it isn't and settles into what it has always been. The building was low and wide cinder block, painted a shade of gray, that had started as charcoal and been bleached by 15 years of Texas sun into something closer to bone. The parking lot was gravel uneven, and there were always at least a dozen trucks parked at angles that suggested their owners had somewhere more important to be, but couldn't quite bring themselves to leave. Inside, the air carried a permanent mixture of gun oil and old coffee, and something harder to name, the smell of men who take things seriously, who believe that what they know and what they can do matters, who measure themselves and each other by a specific set of standards that the rest of the world has largely stopped caring about. The fluorescent lights were the kind that buzzed just below the threshold of conscious annoyance, just loud enough to make you feel slightly on edge without knowing why. Glass cases ran the length of the main room, filled with handguns arranged like jewelry. Behind them, rifles on the wall. Beyond that, a door to the indoor range. And beyond that, a door to the outdoor range, where on any given Friday afternoon you could hear the irregular percussion of men proving something to themselves. That particular Friday, the indoor room was crowded. A demo had been running out back since 2 o'clock, and a good portion of the men who had come for that had drifted inside when the wind picked up, carrying their opinions and their energy drinks and their voices, which were all louder than necessary. This was Colt Briggs's kingdom, or so he believed. Colt was 29 years old, lean in the way of a man who exercises as a form of aggression, with a goatee trimmed to a point and eyes that were always slightly narrowed, as though he was perpetually assessing a threat. He had worked the counter at Ironside Arms for 3 years, and in that time had developed a skill. He was proud of the ability to look at a person who walked through the door and know within seconds whether they were worth his attention. He was good at this. He was also wrong more often than he knew, which is the kind of thing that only becomes apparent in hindsight. The other dominant presence in the room that afternoon was Decker Voss, who occupied the space between the handgun case and the rifle wall like a man staking a claim. Decker was 34, broad through the shoulders, with forearms that drew attention and a backward-facing cap he wore not as fashion, but as declaration. He had served. 2 tours, honorable discharge, a chest of experience that most men his age couldn't touch. What was also real, though, Decker never said it aloud and barely admitted it to himself in the private hours. He had applied 3 times to BUD/S, the Navy SEAL selection program. Cut each time, the first in the pool phase, the second at Hell Week, the third during a psychological evaluation he still thought about when the lights were out and the house was quiet. 3 times he had reached for the thing that would have made him certain of himself. 3 times the door had closed. So now he came to Ironside Arms on Fridays. He knew the staff by name. He knew the regulars. He knew more about the weapons in the cases than most people in the room, and he made sure they knew it. This was not cruelty exactly. It was compensation, which is a different thing, though it rarely feels different to the people on the receiving end. There were others. Claudette Barrow, 41, wearing a silk blouse under a cashmere coat, holding sparkling water she had brought from somewhere outside, as though the idea of drinking what Ironside Arms offered was beneath her. She was there with a man who had promised to show her something exciting. He was already bored. She was trying not to look like she was. She held her phone at an angle that made it easy to take photos without obviously taking them. Reefa 19 buzzed head. A vape pen he rotated between his fingers like a nervous habit was there, with 2 friends who treated him like an audience, laughing at his jokes with the slightly too loud enthusiasm of people who want to be seen laughing. And then there was Garrett Shea. Garrett sat in a chair at the far end of the room near the corner where the rifle wall met the emergency exit nobody ever used. He was 73 years old. He wore a canvas jacket washed so many times the color had gone from olive to something without a name, and a plain cap with no insignia, no text, no decoration of any kind. His face was the face of a man who had spent decades outdoors doing things that left marks not dramatic. Marks not the weathering of cinema, but the specific lines that come from years of squinting against wind and sun and uncertainty. He had a cup of coffee on the small table beside him. Garrett came to Ironside Arms every Friday, had for 9 years since he retired and moved from Colorado to San Antonio to be closer to his daughter and her family. He didn't come to buy, mostly. He came because it was the kind of place where he didn't have to explain himself, where a man could sit with his thoughts and the comfortable weight of things he understood without anyone asking him how he was feeling about it. He had served in the Army. His years of active service had run through the long, deliberate exhale of the post-Vietnam era, the Cold War's steady state of preparation and readiness and rehearsal for a conflict that kept not quite arriving. He had trained in ranges not unlike this one. He had trained in weather that would have emptied this parking lot in 20 minutes. He had served with men who were extraordinary and with men who were not, and over 5 decades he had developed the ability to tell the difference quickly and quietly and without making a production of it. He was doing that now. The door opened at 4:37 in the afternoon. Later, several people in the room would remember this differently. Some would say she walked in confidently. Some would say she looked lost. One man would insist 6 months later over a beer that she looked like she was in the wrong place and knew it. Human memory fills in the gaps with what we expected to see rather than what was actually there. What was actually there was this: a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, brown hair loose touching the collar of a faded green windbreaker that had once been a deeper color and been washed back to something softer over years of use. Jeans without any particular statement to make. Sneakers, and this is the detail that Colt would mention first, that Claudette would photograph, that Reef would reference, with a laugh that was mostly performance sneakers, with a sole separating at the toe of the left foot. Not broken, not falling apart, but telling the story of a lot of miles. She carried a canvas backpack, gray, no brand identity, no aspirations. One of the straps had been repaired at some point with a knot that worked but didn't match. She moved through this door the way water moves, without announcement, filling the space she occupied, without seeming to push anything else out of the way. She didn't look around with the eager inventory of someone new or the careful casualness of someone trying not to look new. She looked at the room the way you look at a landscape you have seen in different forms your whole life and recognized the essential shape of. Before she had taken 3 steps, Colt was already talking. The exact words varied depending on who told the story afterward, but the shape of it was this: a comment about yoga, about the coffee shop across the street, about her being in the wrong place. He said it loudly enough to carry, and the room responded the way rooms do when they have already decided, with the low ripple of appreciation, the sound of people relieved to have their assessment confirmed by someone willing to say it out loud. Decker added something about the backpack. Reef's friend slapped his shoulder, urging him on, and he obliged with something about Instagram. Claudette raised her phone. The woman didn't respond, not directly. She didn't stiffen, didn't flush, didn't redirect her attention toward the people speaking. She simply continued doing what she had been doing, which was moving toward the rifle cases along the back wall. And she did this so without drama, so without the performance of indifference, that several people would later describe it as unnerving before they were even conscious of being unnerved. Her name was Maya Callahan, but the room didn't know that yet. The room knew only what it could see, and what it saw it had already decided. She stopped at the rifle cases, not at the handguns near the door, not at the accessories display where most first-timers pause to orient themselves. She went to the rifles, specifically the section along the far right wall, and she stood before it with a stillness that was somehow different from the stillness of browsing. Garrett Shea from his corner set his coffee down and did not pick it up again. Colt had followed her to the case, still talking about the weight of the rifles, about the price, about whether she knew what she was looking at. His voice had the rhythm of a man who expects his audience to eventually give him what he wants, which is either a laugh or a flinch or an exit. He was used to getting one of the 3. She turned her head slightly, not to look at him, but in the way of someone cataloging background noise. What happened next was quiet. She raised one hand unhurried and let her knuckles rest against the glass. Not a knock, not a tap. The way you indicate something without pointing at it. And she spoke, and her voice was soft enough that the people nearest to her had to stop talking to hear it, and then the people behind them stopped, because the people nearest to her had stopped, and so the quiet moved outward like a ripple until the room held the kind of silence you don't plan for. She said, "Show me the MRAI Ghost Edition, the unreleased variant, serial prefix 7 Viper." 14 words. 14 words and the room changed. Later, trying to explain it to people who hadn't been there, the regulars would reach for comparisons and come up short. Someone said it was like when a stranger sits down at a piano at a party and plays something that shouldn't be possible. Someone else said it was like hearing a code word in a conversation you didn't know was coded. The closest any of them would come was simply this: she said something she shouldn't have known. And the room understood that immediately, even the parts of it that didn't know why. Colt's mouth closed. The laugh forming behind his teeth stopped forming. The MRAI Ghost Edition was not a name you found in any catalog, not on the website, not in any publication that civilian enthusiasts circulated. The serial prefix 7 Viper was something else entirely, a designation used internally, a shorthand that had never, to Colt's knowledge, existed outside classified operational contexts. He looked toward the back of the shop. Randall Stoddard came through the stockroom door without being called, which was unusual. He had managed Ironside Arms for 11 years and carried the manner of a man who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. He was heavy-set with a buzz cut that had been practical once and was now simply habit and an expression that suggested permanent mild displeasure with the general state of things. He took one look at Maya, then he walked without ceremony to the vault behind the main counter, not the display case, but the locked vault behind it, the one that most customers didn't know existed, and that Colt himself had seen opened only twice, and he removed the key from his belt and he opened it. The room watched. Stoddard placed the rifle on the counter. It was matte black in the way of something engineered rather than styled. No gleam, no reflection, a surface that absorbed light rather than returning it. The scope mounted above the receiver was not a standard configuration. The stock had a profile that firearms enthusiasts in the room recognized the way you recognize a face seen in a photograph but never in person. They knew the shape of it without knowing they knew it. Nobody in the room had ever seen one in open air. Colt stared at it. He looked at Maya. He looked back at the rifle. For the first time in 3 years at that counter, he had nothing to say. Reef's vape pen had stopped moving. Claudette's phone was angled toward the counter, but her thumb wasn't pressing anything. Decker Voss stood very still. On his face was an expression that had nothing to do with the performance he had been putting on for the last hour. He was looking at the rifle the way a man looks at something he has heard about and not believed was real. Walt Harlan, the shop's gunsmith, had been at his workbench in the far corner doing what he did most Friday afternoons, which was quiet and methodical work that required him to be aware of his surroundings only enough to avoid interruption. He was 61 years old, with hands stained by gun oil long enough that the color had become part of his skin. He had started his career as an armorer for the Army 8 years before transitioning to civilian work, and in over 2 decades of combined service, he had a granular understanding of precision firearms that most people in the industry couldn't match. He had looked up when Stoddard went to the vault. He was still looking, and in the corner, Garrett Shea stood up. He didn't move toward the counter. He didn't speak. He just rose from his chair slowly with the deliberate mechanics of a man whose joints have their own memory, and stood there with his hands at his sides watching. He didn't know her. He had never seen her face. But in 35 years of military service and 15 years of living afterward and carrying everything that service had taught him about how to read a person, Garrett Shea looked at the woman standing at that counter in her worn-out shoes and her faded jacket and felt something shift in his chest the way a compass shifts when it comes close to a field strong enough to move it. He knew with the certainty of a man who has learned to trust that quiet internal signal that what was happening in this room was not what it appeared to be. He stood and he watched. Maya's eyes came down to the rifle. Not with the excitement of someone seeing something for the first time, not with the reverence of a collector, with the recognition of someone encountering something that has belonged to them, the way your hands move to a familiar object in the dark without needing to look. She reached out, and her right hand settled onto the receiver. Colt found his voice. It was smaller than before, but he found it. He said the rifle weighed over 22 pounds. He said it with the desperation of a man watching a bluff get called and reaching for another card. She held it. One-handed briefly, the muzzle finding its angle, and then she brought it up and settled it against her shoulder in a motion so absent of adjustment and repositioning that Decker Voss took an involuntary half-step backward and caught himself and pretended he hadn't. Colt said, "Go ahead, disassemble it." He said it as a dare, the kind of dare you issue when you are certain the thing cannot be done. She set the rifle on the counter. Her hands moved. What followed was less than 10 seconds in duration and more than 20 years of something that cannot be purchased with enthusiasm or accumulated by simply caring about the subject. 8 seconds. 11 components laid on the glass surface in a sequence so precise it resembled a diagram in a technical manual. Each piece placed rather than dropped, each one touching the counter with a soft, exact sound. The order was not the order a civilian learns. It was not the standard military training sequence. It was a third sequence developed for speed under specific operational conditions, one that Harlan had encountered exactly once before at a facility in Colorado during a consultation he had been asked not to discuss. He set down the tool in his hand. The room was silent in the way that rooms go silent when something has happened that everyone has felt and nobody has words for yet. Decker was not speaking. Claudette had lowered her phone entirely. Reef stood with the vape pen forgotten in his fingers, his face doing something it didn't usually do: nothing. No performance, no reaction calibrated for an audience, just the open, unguarded expression of someone confronting something they have no category for. Colt was still at the counter, still technically in charge of this interaction. He said something, some further challenge, some attempt to hold the ground that was leaving him, and while he spoke, Maya did something quiet and small that the room almost missed. She paused in the reassembly. She reached into her backpack without looking at it and removed a paper clip. Ordinary, the kind found in the bottom of a desk drawer. She held it lightly between two fingers and pressed it gently against a specific point on the receiver. The bolt channel gap, a tolerance specification that even many certified armorers never think to check, because it falls within the standard deviation most manufacturers consider acceptable. She looked at it for a moment with her head slightly tilted. Then she said in a voice quiet enough to require silence in order to be heard clearly, and the room provided that silence without being asked. The bolt is 0.3 millimeters off spec. In sub-zero wind above 7,000 feet, it drifts 4 inches left at 300 meters. No one spoke. From across the room, the man named Holt, who had been standing near the ammunition shelf with the watchful stillness of someone accustomed to assessing rooms for reasons that had nothing to do with shopping, said the first thing that had been said in response to Maya that wasn't mockery. He said, "How do you know that?" Not a question, a request for accounting. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Wheeler Peak, summit, wind 61 miles per hour, minus 18 Fahrenheit, moving target. Wheeler Peak, Southern Rocky Mountains, New Mexico, elevation 13,161 feet. Above the tree line, above the logic of most training programs, a place where the variables governing precision shooting compound and multiply into something altogether different from what they are at sea level on a comfortable afternoon." Holt was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back until his shoulders met the shelf behind him, and he did not move from there. Garrett, standing in his corner, felt it again. He had spent 35 years learning a language, not of firearms or tactics, though he spoke those fluently, but of capability. The difference between a person who knows a thing and a person who has lived a thing until the two are no longer separate. He had served with men who carried that quality. He had served alongside men who did not and understood what the difference sometimes cost. He had not expected to see it here. He had not expected it in her, not from any limitation of imagination, but because people who carry this kind of depth tend to exist somewhere else, somewhere harder, somewhere that does not include a retail firearms counter in San Antonio on a Friday afternoon. He looked at her hands completing the reassembly. He looked at the scar on her right hand, not the clean line of surgery, not the mark of an accident, but as something older and more layered. The kind of mark that raises questions well-mannered people don't ask. He looked at the backpack, at a patch near the bottom, barely visible, faded nearly to disappearing. The shape of it nudged at something in the back of his memory without opening the door fully. Colt opened his mouth. She said, "Do you want to see it reassembled, or are we going to keep doing this?" No heat, no challenge, no satisfaction. She said it the way you state a logistical question, the way a person with more important things waiting asks whether the current business is concluded. Colt closed his mouth, and Garrett Shea in his corner crossed his arms over his chest and watched what was going to happen next, with the quiet, patient attention of a man who has learned over 73 years that the moments worth waiting for almost never announce themselves in advance. Almost never. But sometimes on a Friday afternoon in November, in a room that has just been reminded of what it does not know, you can feel them coming. Part 2. The weight of what you carry. The room did not recover quickly from those words. Wheeler Peak, summit, wind 61 miles per hour, minus 18 Fahrenheit, moving target. Words do not usually have physical weight. These did. You could feel them settling the way cold air settles when a door opens in winter. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the slow and undeniable replacement of one condition with another. The air in Ironside Arms was different after them than it had been before, and everyone in the room felt this without being able to name it, which is often how the most important things make themselves known. Holt had not moved from the ammunition shelf. He stood with his shoulders against the metal rack, and he was watching Maya with the focused attention of a man running calculations he hadn't expected to need. He had spent the better part of 2 decades in environments where the ability to assess another person's capabilities quickly and without sentiment was not a professional skill but a condition of continued existence. He was rarely wrong in these assessments. He was not wrong now. He simply didn't yet know the full dimension of what he was looking at. Harlan remained at his workbench. He was looking not at Maya, but at the 11 components on the counter, at the order of them, the spacing, the angle at which each piece had come to rest. The sequence she had used was not the civilian sequence, not the standard military training sequence. It was a third one developed for specific operational conditions, appearing in documentation that did not circulate widely. He had seen it once years ago at a facility outside Colorado Springs during a consultation he had been cleared for, at a level that did not permit him to ask follow-up questions about what he observed. He set his calipers down on the bench and said nothing. Stoddard had moved back toward the vault. Not to close it, it was already closed, but toward it in the direction of the back of the space. His arms were crossed. His face held the expression of a man who has identified a problem but is not yet prepared to name it. Colt was still at the counter. This required accounting because Colt was not someone who adapted quickly to losing the advantage. He had a talent for recovery, for finding the next angle, for maintaining the performance of confidence, even when the confidence had developed cracks. It was useful in many situations, and a liability in others, and this was one of the others. He said, okay, so you know the rifle. He said, so you can spot a tolerance issue. He said, that's a real party trick, very impressive. He said all of this in the voice of a man building a wall out of words, trying to reconstruct what the room had been before 14 words brought it down. And then he said, let's see you shoot it. He said it as though it had just occurred to him, as though it were a natural next step, as though it were not in fact a pivot and a deliberate attempt to move the contest to ground where he felt more certain of the outcome. Stoddard looked at him, then at Maya. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite decision and not quite surrender, but lived in the space between them. He said, we've got the outdoor range. He said it with his manager's voice, the neutral tone of institutional process. There is a target at the far end, 150 meters. He did not describe the target. The people in the room who had been coming to Ironside Arms long enough already knew. The coin had been hanging at 150 meters for 6 years. A $50, the old kind, with the ridged edge and the real weight of metal that carries history in its alloy. Stoddard had put it there himself 6 years prior after a conversation with a retired competitive shooter who claimed the shot was trivial for anyone with proper training. Stoddard had bet otherwise. The competitive shooter had missed 3 times and paid for his drinks. In the 6 years since, through 4 range staff, 11 regular sharpshooters, 2 amateur competitions, and 1 occasion when a man drove from Austin specifically to attempt it with a $14,000 rifle, the coin had not been touched. This was what Stoddard was offering. He offered it with the comfortable expectation that the impossible would remain impossible. The crowd moved toward the door to the outdoor range, and Decker moved with them, positioning himself at the front, occupying the role of expert observer. He wanted to be there first. He wanted his assessment of what happened to be the one that mattered. Holt moved too, though differently from the others. No eagerness, just the quiet repositioning of someone who intends to see what happens and has no need to perform interest in it. Maya picked up the rifle. She did not ask permission. She carried it the way you carry something that has shaped itself to your hands over time with the ease of long familiarity, even if the specific instance of the object is new. She walked through the door. Outside, the November air was cold and direct, the kind that San Antonio produces in autumn when the Gulf wind drops and the northern air comes down without obstacle across the flat country. The range was hard-packed earth and dry grass target posts at intervals, and the coin at the far end catching what remained of the afternoon light in small, irregular flashes. 150 meters. The gathering arranged itself along the near end with the organic clustering of people who want to watch something happen and are not quite willing to admit they expect to be surprised by it. Decker stood with his arms crossed. Reef's friends nudged each other. Claudette found a position where she could capture both Maya and the target in the same frame. Garrett stood a little apart, his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He was not watching the target. He was watching Maya, the way she approached the firing line, the way she settled her feet before she reached it, the small automatic adjustments of posture that a person makes when their body knows what is about to happen. He had seen this before, not often, but he had seen it. Maya reached the firing line. She did not perform a pre-shot routine in any way the observers would have recognized as one. She did not roll her shoulders, did not take a series of deliberate breaths, did not close one eye and open it again. She raised the rifle to her shoulder with the same economy of motion that had characterized everything she had done in that building, settled the stock and looked through the scope. 2 seconds. One shot. The sound reached them a fraction before the result did. The coins separated, not knocked intact from the string, not sent spinning, but divided the two halves, catching the light differently as they fell, one tumbling left and one right, each piece taking a last flash of sun before it hit the ground. Nobody spoke. This was the silence that does not arrive from politeness or from waiting for permission to react. It comes when a room full of people simultaneously confronts the fact that they were wrong about something in a way that carries implications larger than the moment. The kind of silence that falls when the world reorganizes itself around a fact that wasn't there before. Decker Voss uncrossed his arms. It was a small thing physically, just the movement of releasing a posture. But he had crossed those arms when Maya walked through the front door and maintained them through everything that followed. The comments, the laughter, the rifle, the 8 seconds, the 0.3 millimeters, and their release. Now, without his seeming to notice he was doing it, said something he could not have put into words. 3 years of applications. 3 times reaching for the thing that would have made him certain of himself. He had built a life in the margin between what he had attempted and what he had achieved, and the story he told about that margin had been load-bearing. It held things up. He had needed it to hold things up. In 2 seconds, without knowing anything about his story, a woman in shoes held together by habit had reached past the ceiling he had been measuring himself against and found another ceiling above it that he had not known was there. He turned and walked back toward the building. His friends made no comment. Reef's group went quiet. The crowd fractured and followed in ones and twos, and the coin's 2 halves lay in the dirt of the range in the long light of a November afternoon. Garrett was last to turn. He stood at the firing line for a moment, after the others had started moving, looking downrange at the string where the coin had been. He looked at it the way a man looks at physical evidence of something he already understood to be true. Then he followed the others inside. Maya carried the rifle back to the counter. She set it down with the same care with which she had picked it up, precisely without drama, in the same position and at the same angle it had occupied before. Stoddard looked at the rifle and at Maya, and he did not say anything. She unzipped her backpack. She reached inside and removed a cloth. A small rectangle of fabric, old, the color washed down to something between gray and brown by more cleanings than could be counted. She unfolded it and wiped her hands slowly with the deliberateness of someone performing a ritual that has been performed many times, and the cloth moved across her palms and her fingers and then stopped. Claudette saw it first. She had lowered her phone and was standing close enough to have a clear view, and what she saw made her take a breath that she did not release for a long moment. The stain was in the center and spread outward without symmetry, dark and irregular, the color that blood turns when it has dried into fabric and been washed and carried for a long time in conditions that are not gentle. It had not come out. It had never quite come out. Some things don't. Claudette didn't speak. She didn't raise her phone. She looked at the cloth and then looked away and found something on the far wall that required her attention. Reef's friends had stopped talking to each other. Garrett from near the wall saw the cloth. He saw Claudette's reaction. He saw the way the room reorganized itself around this small object and its wordless testimony, and something in his chest tightened with a specific and familiar ache. Not grief in the dramatic sense, but the older thing underneath grief. The thing that outlasts it. The thing that stays. There are people who carry something like that, he thought. Not many, but you meet them sometimes in certain rooms in certain moments. You recognize them not by what they say, but by what they are careful never to say. By what they carry without display. By the texture of their silence, which is different from ordinary silence, in a way that takes years of living to distinguish. He had known men like that. Some of them had come home, some hadn't. Maya folded the cloth. She placed it in the backpack with the same precision and care she placed everything, not tenderness exactly, but the attention of someone for whom objects have histories that are not separate from their own. Her hand moved briefly to the outside pocket of her jacket. A small motion, half-conscious, the way your hand moves towards something you carry close without always knowing you are reaching for it. Then she withdrew it. Colt was still at the counter. To the credit of whatever instinct operates beneath the level of ego, he had been quiet since the shot. He had stood behind the counter and processed in the way people process what they did not anticipate needing to process, the accumulation of what had happened in the last 45 minutes. He arrived eventually at procedure. Procedure was solid. Procedure was real. It existed regardless of what a person could do with a rifle, regardless of coins at 150 meters, regardless of classified serial prefixes and paper clips and bolt tolerances in sub-zero conditions. Procedure was the ground under his feet when everything else had become uncertain. He said, "I need to see identification." He said it with the recovered authority of someone gripping something firm. He said it was policy that handling a weapon of this classification required registration. He said he should have asked at the start, and this was nothing personal. Stoddard did not contradict him. He crossed his arms and waited. Maya looked at Colt for a moment. Then she reached into the backpack. What she placed on the counter was a card roughly the size and shape of a standard identification card, but the resemblance ended there. No photograph, no name, a pale background, once white, carrying a sequence of numbers arranged in a format that corresponded to nothing. Not a driver's license, not a military ID, not a government employee code in any configuration that Colt or Stoddard or anyone else in the room would recognize. In the lower right corner, very small, almost worn away, was a shape, a symbol. The lines were faded enough that you had to look at it directly to see it at all. Colt picked it up. He held it toward the light. He turned it over. The back was blank. He looked at Stoddard. Stoddard looked at the card. Something moved in his face, not recognition exactly, but proximity to it. The sensation of a word on the tip of a tongue. He had seen something once years ago during a consultation with a government purchasing agent. A card like this had appeared briefly on a table and been collected again before he had the chance to study it. He had never learned what it meant. He had known enough not to ask. He said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this isn't a valid form of identification for our purposes." He said it with the voice of a man not entirely sure of what he is doing, but committed to doing it anyway. He said she would need to step back from the counter. Colt looked relieved in the way people look when someone else makes a decision they were afraid to make themselves. Decker Voss near the rifle wall said nothing. He had been saying nothing for quite some time. He was watching Maya with an expression that had worked through several versions of itself in the last half hour and landed finally somewhere that didn't perform for the room. It was not a comfortable expression. It was the expression of a man conducting an accounting he has been avoiding. He looked at her hands. He looked at the cloth folded into the backpack. He looked at the worn canvas strap and the repaired knot and the barely visible patch near the bottom of the bag. He did not say anything. Maya put the card back in the backpack. She zipped it, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, turned toward the door. The room did not stop her. 6 of the last 7 hours in that room had involved overlapping, competing voices filling every available silence. Now the voices were absent, and Maya moved through the absence toward the door, and the only sound was the slight scuff of her left shoe on the polished floor, the separating sole catching infinitesimally on the surface and then releasing. She was almost at the door when she stopped. She stopped the way you stop when you remember something you almost forgot, with the economy of a person for whom no movement is theatrical. She unzipped the backpack again, reached inside, removed a small metal case no larger than a cigarette pack, matte finished with the same quality of light absorption as the rifle had had. On its surface was an etching, precise and deliberate, cut into the metal with the clean lines of professional equipment, a symbol that nobody in the room had a name for. She set it on the counter. Metal on glass, quiet and exact, like the period at the end of a long sentence. She did not explain it. She did not indicate who it was for or what it contained. She set it there, stepped back, and turned to the door. The room looked at the box. The etching was specific in the way of something that has meaning to the people for whom it is intended and impenetrable in the same way to everyone else. Colt looked at it. Stoddard looked at it. His jaw tightened at the hinge, the small, muscular response of a man standing at the border of something he cannot see the other side of. Maya turned back to the door, and the door opened before she reached it. Part 3 Arrow. The man who came through was tall and moved with an economy of motion that the room registered before anything else about him, the precise placement of each step, absence of any movement that was not load-bearing. He wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt and glasses that in the indoor afternoon light served no visual purpose, and he crossed the floor of Ironside Arms without looking at anyone except Maya, which he did immediately and completely, the way a compass needle moves to north. He stopped in front of her. The room held its breath. He lowered his head. It was a controlled motion, precise with the quality of something practiced, until it became reflex. His left hand came up to his chest and rested there, flat fingers together, held for a moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4 before it released. The gesture was small. The gesture was the quietest thing that had happened in that room all afternoon. It was also the loudest. Garrett Shea felt it reach him from across the room like a frequency below the threshold of hearing that the body registers before the mind catches up. His weight shifted. He had seen this gesture once before at a distance, in a context he had never been cleared to fully understand. He understood enough. He stood very still and did not look away. Harlan put both hands flat on his workbench surface and did not move. Holt took 1 step backward until his shoulders met the ammunition shelf behind him. His arms, which had been loose at his sides, stayed loose, open, the posture of a man who recognizes something above his own level and responds the only appropriate way, which is with stillness and deference and silence. Three men in the room who had been in enough specific places to know what they were seeing. Three men who, without exchanging a word, made the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion and responded with the same instinct. Step back, be quiet. Do not complicate what is happening with your presence. The man in the dark jacket spoke. His voice was low enough that the words reached Maya and did not travel past her. The room could not hear the content, but the register carried the timbre of authority that is not performed because it has never needed to be the voice of someone who speaks rarely and has long since stopped concerning himself with whether he will be heard. He said something. Maya received it without visible reaction, without the small adjustments of expression that most people make when taking in information of consequence. She listened with the quality of attention that does not perform itself. Then he stepped to her side, not behind her, not before her. Beside her, in the position of someone who has delivered what he came to deliver and is now waiting for the person he delivered it to. His name was Calloway. He worked for an organization that had no public presence and no listed address and appeared in no government directory available to the civilian population or to most of the military one. He had traveled from a facility that does not appear on maps to a gun shop in San Antonio because a person who mattered to that organization was in San Antonio, and the window was opening, and time was the kind of resource that, in his line of work, you did not waste. Maya did not move immediately. She looked at the room once, not at anyone in particular. A slow, level survey from one side to the other, carrying in it nothing of triumph, nothing of heat, nothing of the satisfaction of a contested afternoon resolved in her favor. It was the look of someone taking inventory of a space they are about to leave, the kind of look you give a room when you want to remember what it contained, not because the room was important, but because you are the kind of person who remembers. Her eyes moved across Colt, whose clipboard hung forgotten at his side, across Stoddard, pale and still behind the counter, across Claudette, who had put her phone in her bag and left it there, across Reef, who had stopped moving entirely, across the space near the rifle wall where Decker had stood before he left. Then her eyes moved to Garrett. It was brief, a second perhaps slightly less. It carried no message that could be transcribed, but it had the quality of recognition, the passing acknowledgement between two people who understand something without requiring it to be stated the way certain frequencies are audible to certain ears and not to others. Garrett held the look without moving. Then Maya reached into her jacket pocket. The shell casing was small in her palm. Old brass worn to the texture of an object, handled often, and over a long time the rifling marks along its base faded but still traceable. It had not been left to tarnish. It had been polished deliberately, carefully, with the attention you extend to something that has no practical purpose anymore, but carries another kind of purpose that you are not willing to let go of. She set it on the counter beside the metal box. The sound of it, brass on glass clean and final, reached every corner of the room. She did not explain it. She did not look at Colt, did not look at Stoddard, did not look at the faces arranged around the room with their various degrees of comprehension and discomfort, and the slow, reluctant awakening of something they would need more time to fully name. She adjusted the strap of the backpack on her shoulder. She turned to the door, and the man named Calloway turned with her, and they walked through it together, and the door closed behind them both with the same quiet sound. It always makes the sound of mechanism doing what it was designed to do, indifferent to what has just passed through it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The shell casing sat beside the metal box on the glass counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed above the whole of it. The smell of gun oil was in the air. The outdoor range was still and empty, and at 150 meters, 2 pieces of a $50 lay in the dirt where they had fallen, and the string between the posts swayed slightly in the November wind with nothing left to hold. Colt Briggs looked at the clipboard in his hand. He set it on the counter beside the shell casing. He picked it up again. He was not reading it. Garrett Shea uncrossed his arms. He walked to the counter slowly with the deliberate pace of his 73 years, and he stood looking at the shell casing. He did not pick it up. He looked at the worn surface of it, at the way it caught the harsh fluorescent light, without returning much of it, and in his face was something that the people who knew him well would have recognized, the expression he sometimes got at the dinner table in the middle of an ordinary evening when he went somewhere briefly that no one else at the table could follow. He turned to Colt. "Son," he said. His voice was even. There was no heat in it, no lecture, no architecture of a lesson. He said it the way you state something permanently true. The way you say the sun rises in the east, not as argument, not as persuasion, but as fact, that does not require agreement to remain what it is. There are people in this country, Garrett said, who have paid for your right to stand there and run your mouth. "You just met one." He said it once. Then he walked back to the corner table. He picked up his coffee cup. He held it for a moment, feeling the cold weight of it. He set it back down. The room held what it had been given and found nothing adequate to put in its place. The consequences came the way consequences usually come, not with the dramatic timing of fiction, but with the ordinary grinding patience of reality. Colt Briggs received a call at 6:47 that evening. He was in his apartment in the kitchen making dinner with more concentration than the task required, because the concentration gave him somewhere to put his attention. That was not what had happened that afternoon. The call was from the shop's owner, a man named Pruitt, who operated 3 firearms retailers in the San Antonio area, and who had in 3 years of Colt's employment called him outside of business hours exactly twice, and both times about scheduling. This was not about scheduling. It lasted 4 minutes. Pruitt's voice was not angry. Something about the absence of anger made it worse. The way the cold before a storm is worse than the storm because it carries the storm's full promise without any of its resolution. He said that Colt's employment was concluded effective immediately. He said this once clearly without elaboration. Final paycheck through standard timeline. Personal belongings by arrangement. Then he ended the call. Colt stood in his kitchen with his phone in his hand and the stove on and the traffic outside his window, and he thought about the card he had held up to the light and the comment he had made about library cards, and the word he found for what he felt was not unfair. That was the thing he couldn't fully argue with. That was the thing that sat in him. Decker Voss made a decision that night that he would regret with a thoroughness that was almost instructive. He had a following, not enormous but real. Men who watched his content about shooting technique and equipment and the culture of the firearms community. He had built it over 2 years with the consistency of someone who had redirected competitive energy into something that rewarded him with the specific currency of being seen. 12,000 subscribers on the day he walked out of Ironside Arms. He sat with the footage on his phone, the scattered clips from the afternoon, and he made an edit. He was technically competent at this. He wrote a caption that framed what had happened as entertainment, a curiosity, a woman who had wandered in and gotten lucky. He posted it at 10:15 that night. By 6 in the morning, the comments had turned, not gradually, quickly with the speed of something that ignites rather than smolders. People who knew the MRAI platform, who recognized the disassembly sequence, who had served in contexts where certain kinds of capability were legible to them, they found the video and said specific things about what they were seeing, and other people shared those things, and by the time Decker woke at 7:30, the story he had posted as one thing had become an entirely different thing. The gear brand that sponsored his content sent an email at 11:42 that morning. 3 sentences. The final one used the phrase "conduct unbecoming" briefly without further elaboration and did not require any. By evening, his subscriber count had dropped by 3,100. He deleted the video. He knew it was too late. He deleted it anyway because there are things you do when useful actions have run out and you still need to be doing something. He sat in his apartment that night and did not turn on the television and did not call anyone. And he thought about 3 applications and 3 rejections and the particular shape of the story he had built around them. And he thought about how the story had been missing something all along, some acknowledgement of what he hadn't known, he didn't know, and about how it had taken this afternoon to show him the gap. He was not in the end angry at her. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. He sat with the absence of anger and found it more uncomfortable than anger would have been, because anger has a direction and what he felt had none. It was just a reckoning, quiet and patient, that he had been avoiding for 3 years and could not avoid anymore. Claudette Barrow deleted the photographs from her phone that night. She had considered posting them in the first hour after leaving the shop, and then she had reviewed them, the images of Maya's jacket, her backpack, the worn canvas, and the separating sole, and she had deleted them without sharing. Not primarily from fear, though fear was somewhere in the calculation. Mostly because what she had been about to share was a story she no longer wanted to have told about a person she no longer wanted to have been for those 45 minutes. She went to a dinner she had scheduled with a group of women she had been close to for 6 years, and she was quiet in a way that was unusual for her. When one of them asked what was wrong, Claudette said nothing was wrong and took a drink of water and thought about a cloth and what it told you about the hands that carried it and about the kind of accounting that can only happen when you are honest about what instrument you have been using to measure things. She was not invited to a gathering the following week. She noticed the absence and did not inquire. She spent the weekend at home in a quiet she had not chosen and was beginning to find, if not comfortable, then at least honest. Stoddard arrived at the shop the next morning to find an envelope on his desk. He did not know how it had gotten there. The shop had been locked. The alarm had not triggered. The envelope was manila standard with nothing written on the outside. He sat and looked at it for a while before picking it up. Inside was a single page. No letterhead, no signature, no identifying information of any kind. What it contained was a sequence of instructions, precise and administrative, in their language regarding specific protocols for handling certain categories of customer interactions and certain categories of identification documents. Government language, the specific kind, measured, comprehensive, carrying institutional authority without naming the institution. The final paragraph advised that the matter had been noted and that no further communication would be forthcoming. Stoddard read it twice. He folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He went to unlock the front door of the shop. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the cold morning air and thought about 11 years of managing this place and how certain he had been until yesterday about the kinds of things that happened within it. Then he went inside and made coffee and opened the shop because it was Saturday and people came in on Saturdays and the work was still the work. Walt Harlan stayed after closing. He always stayed a little late on Fridays. There was usually something on his bench that benefited from the quiet of a room with no customers in it. But tonight he stayed longer than usual, and what he was doing was not what he usually did. He went to the vault. Stoddard had given him access years ago for inspection and maintenance. He removed the MRAI Ghost Edition and carried it to his bench with both hands and set it under the bench light and picked up his calipers. The bolt channel gap measured 0.3 millimeters outside standard specification. He measured it again, the same. He put the rifle aside and returned to the vault. There were two other MRAI variants in stock, not the Ghost Edition, but the same platform family close enough in their specifications to be relevant. He brought them out one at a time and measured each with the same calipers, under the same light, with the same care. The first 0.3 millimeters out of specification. The second 0.28 millimeters. Close enough that in most conditions it would not matter. In sub-zero wind above 7,000 feet firing at a moving target, it would matter. She had known this from a paperclip pressed gently against a receiver, from what her hands understood about the tolerances of this specific mechanism, from knowledge accumulated through a kind of repetition that happens in conditions he did not have clearance to think about. He put the rifles away and locked the vault and stood at his bench with his hands flat on the worn wood surface and looked at the empty space where the counter had held 11 components arranged in a sequence he had seen only once before in his career. Then he thought about the card. He knew where it was. He had watched Colt set it on the counter after Maya left and pick it up again and eventually put it in the drawer under the register with the uncertainty of a man filing something away because he cannot bring himself to discard it. Harlan went to the drawer and opened it. The card was there beside a rubber band and a pen that no longer worked. He picked it up. In ordinary light, it was what it had appeared to be, a pale card with a sequence of numbers and a faded symbol in the lower right corner. The numbers resolved into nothing legible. The symbol was too worn to read clearly under fluorescent overhead. Harlan opened the cabinet under his bench. He kept a UV light there for inspecting certain surface treatments and coatings, a standard tool of his trade. He took it out. He placed the card flat on the bench surface. He held the UV light above it. What ordinary light had hidden the UV revealed. The faded symbol in the lower right corner resolved into sharp and precise lines, a shape that was not ambiguous, not a degraded version of something generic but specific and deliberate. Something in motion, something low and fast, suggesting velocity and purpose and the kind of direction that does not advertise itself. Below the symbol and characters, the UV made clear and unmistakable arrow, and below that smaller, carrying no less weight for its size, clearance obsidian. Harlan stood over the card for a long moment. He had worked on military contracts for 8 years. He had consultations and clearances of his own, modest ones, permitting access to certain specifications and facilities without permitting access to the categories of work that existed above a particular threshold. He knew the clearance structure well enough to understand where obsidian sat within it. He had never personally encountered it. He had heard the level referenced once obliquely in a conversation at a government facility that changed subject quickly when it became apparent he was within earshot. Obsidian was not a level that appeared in documents available to people with his clearances or with clearances considerably above his. It existed in a register that the ordinary architecture of classification did not fully contain, the space where things that do not appear on paper are administered by people who also do not appear on paper. He had let a woman carrying that clearance stand in his shop while a 29-year-old held her card up to the light and made a joke about the library. Harlan turned off the UV light. He placed the card in his workbench drawer, not the one under the register where Colt had put it, but his own drawer, the one with his personal tools, the ones that went home with him. He locked it with the small key on his keychain. From that night forward, every rifle that came to his bench would be checked for bolt channel tolerance first. Not because any procedure required it, because he had been shown that it mattered by someone whose authority to show him things was, as it turned out, well beyond anything he had previously encountered in 21 years of this work. He put on his jacket and turned off the bench light and walked to the switch for the overhead fluorescence. He paused with his hand on it and looked back at the room, the cases, the rifles on the wall, the counter where the shell casing and the metal box still sat, because no one had known what to do with them and no one had felt entitled to move them. He stood there for a moment in the shop that felt different from the shop it had been that morning, and he held what he had just confirmed in the quiet way of a man who has spent his career making sure things are exactly what they are supposed to be, and has just been reminded that precision at its highest levels belongs to a very small number of people in the world. He turned off the lights and walked out into the November night. The black SUV moved through the streets of San Antonio with the fluency of a vehicle that knows where it is going and has no reason to hurry about getting there. The city passed on both sides storefronts and gas stations and restaurants, and the ordinary continuous life of a place that does not know and does not need to know everything that happens within it. Maya sat in the back seat. The backpack was on her lap, her hands resting on top of it, not gripping, just resting the way hands rest on something familiar. Calloway was in the front passenger seat and had been silent since the shop which suited her. The driver was someone she had worked with before, someone who understood the value of silence in the same way she did, as a condition rather than an absence, a thing chosen rather than simply the failure of noise to arrive. She reached into her jacket pocket. The photograph was small, smaller than most photographs people carry, as though whoever had taken it understood that it would be carried and calibrated the size accordingly. The paper had the slightly waxy texture of something handled many times and survived the handling. The edges were soft with wear. The man in the photograph was young, mid-20s probably, in the loose estimation of someone who had known him well enough that age had been beside the point, irrelevant in the way it becomes irrelevant between people who share a specific and serious kind of work. He was in uniform, but the photograph was not a formal portrait. It was the kind of picture taken in a moment of ease, in a place that was briefly calm between things that were not calm, and he was smiling with the expression of someone who has just heard something funny and has not quite finished laughing. She had carried this photograph for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She did not count anymore. The number had simply stayed with her, the way certain numbers do, the way your hands remember the combination to a lock you no longer use. He had been good at this work, better than good. He had carried it the way she carried it, without needing to perform it, without requiring that others see it or confirm it or provide external evidence that it was real. They had been in the same unit for 4 years, and in that time, she had understood that certain things about the work, the commitment of it, the cost of it, the specific weight of what accumulates and is carried forward, it cannot be explained to someone who has not lived them. They can only be recognized in another person who has. She looked at the photograph. She did not look at it with grief in the dramatic sense, because dramatic grief has a timeline, and she had passed the end of that timeline. What she looked at it with was the ordinary, lived-with, permanent kind of loss that does not announce itself every day, but does not leave either, the kind that becomes part of the texture of a life rather than an event within it. The kind you carry not because you cannot put it down, but because putting it down would mean something you are not willing for it to mean. She folded it and placed it back in her pocket. The cloth was in the backpack. She did not take it out. She knew it was there the way you know the location of everything that matters, with the low continuous awarenesses of things that have been with you long enough to become part of the inventory of yourself. Calloway spoke without turning his head. "Mission brief is in the compartment," he said. "Wheels up at 0200. Ground contact at the secondary coordinates." She said understood. The city moved past the windows. San Antonio at evening, lights coming on in houses and restaurants, the ordinary continuous life of a place that had grown without particularly planning to. She had moved through this city before several times in different contexts. She did not think of home as a place. She thought of it as a condition, one that certain people, in certain moments, create briefly and unpredictably in whatever geography happened to contain them. Her mind moved briefly to the man in the corner, the one with the plain cap and the canvas jacket and the coffee he had set down and not picked up again for nearly an hour. The one who had stood when she mentioned Wheeler Peak, who had recognized the salute immediately, who had held her look for a moment at the door with the quality of someone who understands a thing without requiring it to be explained. He had said one sentence at the end, and he had said it in the voice of a man who says things once, because he has learned that repetition does not clarify what is already clear. He had said it not for her, she understood. He had said it because it was true and the room needed to hear it said out loud by someone with the standing to say it. She had found over the years that the people who recognized capability most clearly were not always those who possessed the most of it. Sometimes they were simply people who had lived long enough to understand what it looked like when a person had been somewhere that leaves a mark you cannot manufacture and cannot fake, who had been in enough rooms, witnessed enough moments, accumulated enough of the specific experience that teaches you the difference between what a person performs and what a person is. She thought he had known from the moment she walked through the door. She thought he had sat in his corner and watched the room do what rooms do, make decisions based on insufficient information, mistake the surface for the substance, confuse the appearance of capability with the thing itself, and he had waited with the patience of someone who already knew how it would resolve. The SUV turned onto the highway and the city fell away, and the night came up on both sides, the wide Texas night, the kind that goes to the horizon in every direction and does not stop there. Maya closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Sleeping required a release she was not yet capable of. She allowed the motion of the vehicle and the dark behind her eyes and the sound of the road to occupy the space that thought usually filled. And in that space, she did not think about the shop or the coin or the card or the faces of the people in the room when the door closed behind her. She thought about the work ahead. She thought about the brief in the compartment, the coordinates, the window that opened at midnight. She thought about the chain of events that had been set in motion before this afternoon and would continue past it the way operations continue without regard for the incidental moments that occur in their margins. The stop at Ironside Arms had been marginal, a visit to a city where she happened to be for other reasons, a stop made partly for practical purposes and partly, she could admit this privately, for something else. A need to be in a place that was ordinary, to stand in a room where no one knew anything about her, and to breathe air that was not tactical, and to exist briefly as a person without a designation or a clearance level or a code name shot on a card in invisible ink. She had not quite managed it. Rooms have a way of finding out what they contain. She opened her eyes. Through the window, the lights of the city were small and distant, now the last of San Antonio receding, and ahead the highway was dark and direct, the kind of road that goes where it is going without apology. She said, "Let's go." The driver said nothing. The SUV accelerated. Garrett Shea drove home on I-10. He had driven this road for 9 years since the move from Colorado, and it had the quality of a thing so thoroughly known that the knowing required nothing from him. His hands and body executed the familiar route while his mind was elsewhere, which is one of the more useful properties of a road you have traveled often enough. He thought about the afternoon, not about any particular detail of it in isolation, not cataloging the rifle or the coin or the card or the man in the dark jacket. He thought about it as a whole, the way you think about a piece of music as a whole, not the individual notes, but the shape of it, the thing it adds up to what it leaves in you after it is finished. He thought about the things he had witnessed in his life that earned the word extraordinary. There were not many. He had always been careful with the word, unwilling to expand its application to things that merely exceeded expectation. But there were a handful of moments across the decades where no other word was accurate. He thought about a morning in 1974 in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, when the wind was doing something the trainer said was impossible to work in, and a man he served with had worked in it anyway, with a steadiness suggesting the wind had simply failed to communicate its impossibility to him. He thought about a woman he had served alongside briefly in the late 80s in a capacity he had never been fully informed about, who had a quality of presence in difficult situations that he had never seen matched. He added this afternoon to that list. The list was not long, he kept it carefully. He exited the highway. The streets of his neighborhood were quiet in the November dark lights of houses making warm rectangles against the black, each one a room with people in it, each a complete world with its own furniture of experience and memory, and the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of living a life well. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment after turning off the engine, hands in his lap, the engine ticking as it cooled. He thought about the cloth and what it carried. He thought about a $50 and 2 pieces in the dirt at 150 meters. He thought about a young man behind a counter who had been completely certain about something he understood nothing about, and about the complicated mercy of being shown even badly, even at cost the shape of your own ignorance. He thought about the photograph. He had not seen it. She had reached for it in the SUV. He had not been there. But he had seen her hand go to her jacket pocket twice during the afternoon, the motion half-conscious, the reaching towards something kept close. He knew what that gesture meant. He had made it himself at certain points in certain years, reaching toward the thing that cost you the most, because the cost of it is also the proof that it was real. He got out of the car. He walked to the front door. He went inside. His wife was in the kitchen. The radio was on low, something instrumental, and the smell of dinner was in the air. Something with garlic, something with warmth, and the house had the settled quality of a place lived in, with intention carrying that intention in its walls. She looked up when he came in. She had the particular attentiveness of someone who knows a person well enough to read their entries to understand from the way a man removes his jacket or sets down his keys, something about where the day has taken him. She said, "How was it?" He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his hands flat on the surface, feeling the solid familiar wood of it. He said, "Good day today." She heard something in the way he said it, not in the words but underneath them, in the weight the simple phrase was carrying. She looked at him for a moment with the quiet attention of 41 years, and she understood, as she had understood many times before, that some things he would bring forward when he was ready, and some he would carry quietly, and the carrying was not absence. It was its own kind of keeping, its own kind of faith. She went back to what she was doing. Garrett sat at the table and looked at the wall and thought about a woman in a faded green windbreaker whose shoes were coming apart at the toe, who had walked into an ordinary room carrying an extraordinary weight and carrying it as though it were simply part of her, as though she had long since stopped accounting for it separately from herself, as though the weight in the person had become the same thing, which is what happens when you have carried something long enough and seriously enough. He thought about what she had paid for the right to carry it. He thought about all the rooms she had walked into, and all the rooms like that one, and all the years of doing what she had done in conditions he could approximate but not fully imagine, and all the things she carried in that backpack and in that cloth and in that jacket pocket where her hand went without her seeming to notice. He thought about the photograph she had reached for and not taken out, and he knew with the certainty of a man who has lost his own people that whoever was in it was no longer in the world, and that she carried them anyway every day, the way you carry the people you cannot put down. He thought about the old shooter's observation from years past, something he had heard once from a man who had been in the field and come back changed in the particular way of people who have been where the stakes are absolute. That there are people in this world whose presence makes a room go quiet, not because of anything they do or say, but because the room can feel at some level below articulation that it is standing in the company of something it does not fully understand and probably never will. He thought about Ironside Arms on a Friday afternoon in November. Outside, the November wind did what it does in Texas, moved across the flat ground, with nothing to stop it carrying the cold of everything north of there down into the warmth of the city, patient and enormous and indifferent. Inside, the radio played something low and instrumental, and the smell of dinner was in the air. And Garrett Shea sat at his kitchen table with his hands on the wood and held what the afternoon had given him in the quiet way of a man who knows that some things are not meant to be resolved, only honored. Some things you do not finish processing. You simply carry them forward, the way she carried that cloth, the way she carried that photograph, the way the best of us carry the things that have cost us the most, not as weight, but as testament. Not as burden, but as evidence of what mattered enough to hold on to. He said, "That smells good." She said, "It's ready whenever you are." He said, "A minute." She said, "Take your time." He took his time. He sat in the kitchen of his house on the western edge of a city in Texas with the wind outside and the warmth inside and the weight of 73 years of knowing things. And he held carefully the memory of a room that had read a person wrong and had been shown without patience or ceremony or any particular concern for whether the lesson landed simply by her presence and her competence and her refusal to need them to be right about her exactly how wrong it had been. He had spent 35 years serving a country whose promise he had believed in the complicated, clear-eyed, imperfect way that you believe in something you know well enough to see, honestly. He had seen the ways the promise was kept and the ways it failed to be kept, and he had carried both without letting either one become the only truth. What he had seen that afternoon was the promise kept, not by an institution or a document or a ceremony, by a person, by a woman in worn-out shoes who walked into a room that had already decided who she was and who, without needing the room to reconsider, demonstrated simply and completely, and without any apparent need for acknowledgement, that the room had been wrong. The promise, when it was kept, looked like that. He stood from the table. He went to wash his hands. He came back and sat down to dinner, and the radio played something low, and the wind moved outside, and in Ironside Arms across the city, the shell casing sat on the glass counter, and the metal box sat beside it. Two small objects in a room that felt different from the room it had been that morning. In a workbench drawer, a card lay waiting. On a highway moving north and then east, a black vehicle carried someone toward the next thing already underway, already in motion. The kind of motion that does not pause and does not look back because the work does not permit it, and because she had learned a long time ago, in circumstances she did not discuss, that looking back costs you something you cannot afford to spend. Somewhere over New Mexico, heading into the dark, the stars were very clear. And in a kitchen in San Antonio at a table worn smooth by years of use, a man who had served and come home ate dinner with his wife and said very little and meant all of it, and outside the November wind continued its long passage across the face of the country, moving over everything that had happened that day and everything that would happen tomorrow, patient and enormous, and carrying as wind carries everything it touches without holding any of it. Some things end cleanly. Most things don't. Most things simply continue changed and in ways that take time to measure, carrying forward the marks of what is past, through them the way a room carries long after a person has gone something of what that person was. What Ironside Arms carried after that Friday in November was a particular kind of quiet. Customers noticed it without naming it. The regulars noticed it and said nothing because some of them understood at some level that it was not an absence but a presence, the residue of something that had been there and made its mark and moved on. The coin was never replaced. The string hung empty at 150 meters, swaying when the wind came through, and nobody suggested putting something new at the end of it, and nobody asked why, because the answer was something everyone in the room already knew, and nobody felt like saying out loud. Some shots don't need to be repeated to be remembered. Some people don't need to come back to leave something behind.